The original internet culture or cyber culture or digital culture was very closely tied to cyberpunk. And cyberpunk in turn was very closely tied with this idea of a virtual environment. So, cyberpunk itself gets its start in literature, especially around a novel called Snow Crash. If you want to be kind of well versed in the literature and the aesthetic around internet culture and online culture, that's a must read. You have to read Snow Crash and probably Diamond Age too. Uh, these books kind of set up the expectations around what could be and what was beginning to be. Some of this is also found in something like, well, I mean, the obvious case here is again the Matrix. This idea that we actually live in this immersive virtual world, but certainly in things like, and Lawnmower Man, this terrible B movie where that was built around some of these ideas of being able to involve yourself in a virtual space. And even in Ready Player One, both the book and the film, this idea of stepping into a virtual world. I mean, Ready Player One itself is kind of nostalgic, but it pushes back to this idea of these virtual spaces. The original virtual spaces weren't visual at all. They were MUDs and MOOs, multi-user domains or multi-user dungeons, and then MUDs, object-oriented. These spaces where people used text to describe what was around them, and other people were there, and you could create objects purely out of text. This kind of evolved to a variety of spaces where you could interact as if you using an avatar, as if you were there. So active worlds and on to Second Life, which had kind of a fairly long life out there. There isn't yet a natural successor to Second Life, but I suspect there will be. So it's not like the idea of going into a virtual environment has disappeared. I still think this continues to be on the horizon. I still think there's some deep interest in this. And frankly, one of the things that held this up was the expense of things like head-mounted displays. And now that we have some decent head-mounted displays that are fairly cheap, I suspect we're going to see a resurgence in this idea of a fully immersive virtual environment. We finally have the hardware at a price point where people could actually get into it and use it, and the graphics at a level where it's more has high enough fidelity at low enough cost that people could actually do this. So I think we're going to see a resurgence in this, but especially during the early 90s, this came out of a division between what was considered cyberspace or virtual space, and then what kind of got labeled as meat space. And that meat space sounds gross because it really was dismissive. The idea was, in Snow Crash, he's living out of a storage facility, but it didn't really matter because as soon as you put on your goggles and you went into this other space, you could be something completely different. And so that space mattered more than the real space. You had to feed the meat, you had to feed the body, but in terms of actual sort of your real life, that existed in this virtual space. That was true for Ready Player One to a certain degree too, and a bunch of other fictional accounts around this. Of course, that's a scary idea. There's a story that's about not quite 100 years old now, I think, but that is much older than the idea of computing, let alone the idea of sort of the internet, called The Machine Stops. This idea that people were, they never actually saw their relatives face to face, because this is by E.M. Forrester, because they could interact with them through this network of kind of telephones and wires and whatever. And what happens when that machine stops and you have to get out of your pod. So the dangers of this were already there before anything close to the technology for it was available. It's been part of a dream for much longer than it's been part of a reality. I think you could argue that it's still not part of a reality. That said, this idea of virtual space and meat space no longer has the same level of, I guess, purchase among our collective imagination. It feels somehow, even though I think it's still being developed, it feels somehow quaint because it's been replaced by this idea of our reality taking on virtual components. So some of that, of course, is things like alternative AR, alternate reality systems. But it starts with, frankly, us being able to put computers in our pockets. the idea of mobile and locative computing changes what it is to be using a computer. And more, when you start an app or when you go to a website, they want to know where you are. Is it okay to allow them to know what your position is? Because more and more, all computing is locative computing. Where you are matters a lot to what you're doing in that context. And so if the server or if the program knows where you are, it can set up the context so that it can be more useful to you in that space. So if the computer, if Google knows that I'm out camping and I ask about cranes, they're going to assume that I mean not the paper company nor the big construction equipment, but the bird, right? So it's simple things like that, but it can get much more complicated. It knows where things around me are, because if it knows where I am on a map, it knows what else is around me and what's going on around me. It knows what shops are open, which might be giving me particular discounts. It might know if some of my friends are nearby. It knows a little bit about a lot when it knows where you are. So I think the biggest kind of move away from virtual environments to this new sort of smart environment really happened with the cell phones. On top of that, you start to get these ideas of alternative reality systems, and a couple of my graduate students last semester did alternate reality systems. One of them for their kind of master's projects. One of them was a game that you could play in downtown Phoenix, where it was kind of like a detective game, but you had to walk around to the locations where the detective kind of discovered things. It was pretty cool. And then the other was a way of remembering people who had passed away, and kind of a gravestone or a location where you could bring up a virtual version of them so they could tell you about themselves, a screen that would pop up and they could talk about why that experience was important to them. So you could create sort of virtual memorials for people. So both of those are based on, again, phones. Once the phones could be, once you can hold up a phone, you hold it up and you say, point it at something, and then you're layering things on top of it. That's kind of one level of stepping into this virtual space, or this kind of augmented space. So that, I think, breaks down this idea that it doesn't matter where you are. I mean, and it's much more, if you've played Run Zombies, which is a game where you run away from zombies, it's kind of a way of getting you to run faster and further. This is rather than putting you in this virtual environment, it puts virtual stuff in your environment. And so that's part of it, this augmented reality piece. The other piece is things beginning to think. This is the Internet of Things piece. And that is really important too. This means you don't just have the computer in your pocket, but the things around you also have computers that are connected to the internet that can talk about their own location and their status. And it's become so inexpensive to create sort of these beacons and something that can use internet protocol, that you can put this into basically anything that has an on-off switch. And actually, on-off switches themselves are disappearing, but anything that has electricity running through it could be connected to the internet. And if you believe the IoT evangelists, everything that does have electricity running to it will be connected to the internet. So, your car, already many cars are always connected to the internet. They can tell you where they are if you've lost them. It's not just Find My Phone, but Find My Car too. This is mostly, I guess, BMW Connect does this. A number of car companies are doing this to a certain extent. The classic example is the refrigerator, but it's really kind of a trivial example given everything else that can go into it. So both augmented reality and the Internet of Things is about layering information over real life environments. It's not about going somewhere else. It's about taking your physical environment and enriching it. And that is really a change in the way we think about tech, the way we think about what an internet sort of mediated space would look like. And I think we're going to see that space moving much more quickly than the VR part, than the virtual reality as well. I think this idea of being able to layer things on top of our existing reality is really, really compelling. And it gets away from this dichotomy of meat space and virtual space, because we are using our own bodies and in some ways enhancing our own bodies, but using our own bodies in this technologically mediated space. And that is, you could talk about presence in a virtual world, but you're actually present in a real world. The presence is built in. And so that has certain affordances that you just can't get in a virtual real world, no matter how well you can simulate that virtual space. What does that mean in real life? Well, if you're trying to get a handle on what IoT looks like, probably the smart home is where it's going to get its start. So some of that is frankly things like devices that are changing the interfaces. So things like Alexa and Google Home and these other sort of non-screen interfaces, although some of them are getting to be screen interfaces too, allow you to access the things in your house. And what are those things? Well, I'm guessing that if you're watching this, some of you at least have done some starter pieces of this. So it might be things like lights that can turn on or off or change color. That seems to be kind of the opening bid. And honestly, that does very little for your house. Okay? But then you add to it an Echo Bee or a Nest, a thermostat that knows when you're there, that can save you a little bit of cash because it doesn't, you don't end up leaving your house at 70 degrees and paying for it at the end of the day. So, these kinds of technologies get plugged in little by little. And before you know it, your house is smart to a greater or lesser degree. All kinds of things are talking to each other. It knows when you're using water and when you're not. It can tell you if something's leaking. Maybe this is attached to your alarm system. Usually it's not for good reasons, but maybe it's attached to your alarm system. It'll let you know if your garage door was left open, or it'll just take care of it for you. All of these pieces, and that's just what you can do right now, right? Every day a new device gets wired that you can throw in your house and have it be attached to this system. You can run audio and video throughout the whole house. Things like Plex and kind of household servers. You can, and the next step there is recognizing people, right? Facial recognition within the house. You can now buy as a service facial recognition. So you know when the person coming up to the front door is, well, you probably have a smart doorbell, right? A Ring or something like that. And it might talk to other Rings and find out that this person is just bothering people. And so if you don't want to deal with a solicitor, when they ring, it won't even ring through to you. You don't have to deal with it because the doorbell itself has decided that this person is bothering you. So that first light bulb doesn't do much other than sort of, hey, check this out. I can use my phone to turn my lights on. And that only has limited real value, more than just a gee whiz value. But as you add more and more to this is called this is one of those devices, sets of devices or technologies that that kind of gets this law, Metcalfe's law, applied to it. So Metcalfe's law is this idea that if you have one telephone, it's pretty worthless. If you're the only one in the world with a phone, you can't use it at all. Once you add one person to that, then it becomes useful because you can call each other. But with each person you add, you get not just one more person you can call, but greater and greater utility. And now when I go in and check in at a restaurant that doesn't take reservations, they know they can text me when my table comes up because 99% of people out there have a cell phone. So once you hit that level of penetration, it becomes almost infinitely more valuable than when there's only 3 or 4 people in the world with a cell phone. So the technology becomes more valuable as more stuff is networked into it. That's definitely true with smart home technologies and IoT more broadly. So I think most of our experience will likely start out in the home. There's reasons that it's not showing up in office places, although it is in an industrial setting somewhat. But in general offices, there's reasons IoT has been slow to be adopted, mostly security reasons. So I think we're probably going to see more of it in the home before we see it out there in our other environments. But we will eventually start to see more and more of this showing up in other places, especially once the kinks are worked out. Right now, the major kink is this question of interoperability. So, when I buy a new phone, I remember when you first set up your first phone, you either had to have someone set it up for you, or you could set it up yourself if you were really skilled. But basically, it was really tricky to get it hooked up to the network, have it be working, all the rest of it. Now I can have Amazon send me a phone, turn it on, and it's going to work. I throw the SIM in and it basically figures it all out for me. Right now, IoT type things, there isn't, for a smart home, you have to decide between 3 or 4 different standard ways of carrying data. You have to decide whether you need a hub or not anymore. Is your thing going to talk to Amazon's products, Microsoft's products, Google's products? Are they all going to talk to each other? There is no standard. So right now, that is one of the major stumbling blocks. With it that comes the security stumbling block. So those things are going to slow us down, but we're trying that out right now in homes. And at some point, a winning combination is going to start to emerge where, it's valuable for everyone to use this standard because that's what everyone's going to be using. So we'll settle in on a standard here. And once that happens, once it becomes easy to figure out how to connect things to this emerging set of Internet of Things, this emerging network, then we'll start to see it growing more quickly when my house can talk to the next door neighbor's house and when all of them can talk to the road. I think we see some of the possibilities of this around Waze. Waze doesn't need any other data than all of its users. It uses all the other Waze users as sensing devices to see where there's traffic problems. They can measure that by whether the other users are reporting motion or not. And so you get some really nice sort of leverage from being able to connect a whole range of things at once. And once that moves from a light bulb to everything in your house, and then once that moves to intelligent cities, to transportation networks, to power and utility networks, to anticipating problems ranging from medical emergencies to fire kind of safety issues, so that you can figure out, if there's a large scale disaster, you can figure out where everyone is and tell them the best way to get out of where they need to be, and all of these pieces for a smart city. And then you can start to do things that you couldn't do before. You can start to have, especially with an intelligent transportations network that also includes self-driving cars and little delivery autonomous devices. This is already starting in some places. In Washington, D.C. and Berkeley, they have autonomous little robots that will deliver food to you and other things to you. So we're already starting to see it. But when that becomes ubiquitous, that really changes what a network means. It means that everything around us is always thinking, is always transmitting data, that there's layers and layers of information all around us. And that is a huge departure from the way we thought it would be, not just in the 1990s, not just in the 2000s, but going back all the way into the 30s when people started to think about what an online life would be. And so we've had a sea change in moving from us entering into this digital and virtual environment to this digital and virtual environment kind of enveloping us and the things around us.